Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on when you're watching this video. So, I want to talk a little bit about theoretical concepts on a larger scale than what your book is doing. Um, in this chapter, we begin truly looking at the individualized theoretical approaches to understanding crime and criminality. Now, we have two major camps when it comes to approaching the crime and criminality problem. The first one is the classical theorist, and the second one is the positivist. Now, we'll get into the positivists in future chapters. This chapter really focuses on classical theorists, and I want to give you a broader understanding of those two camps before we actually launch into understanding the individualized theories, such as rational choice theory and other types of theories that follow along with classical theorists in chapter 4. Classical theory is rooted in the 1800s. It truly came from Cesar Beccaria, who wrote on crimes and punishment. And I've given you an excerpt of his writings to read and to do an assignment on because I think it's important to understand the foundations of this particular theoretical approach. Understanding that during that period of time, there was multitudes of capital offenses, so things that you could be executed for, hundreds of cases and types of things on the books that you could be executed for because there really were no books, and law was applied depending on who was applying the law and depending on who had committed the crime and who the victim was. It was very arbitrary and there was no consistency. In fact, it was so arbitrary and inconsistent and out of control that Cesar Beccaria initially published On Crimes and Punishment as an anonymous essay challenging the processes in place. He eventually took credit for it later when it was so well received by the public and society because many people realized the value of what he suggested in terms of how to address the crime problem. And Cesar Beccaria is a classical theorist. He initiated this concept. And I think when you read On Crimes and Punishment, you'll see a lot of correlations between it and even our Constitution. Okay, but classical theorists have some very common things, a thread amongst them, despite their different approaches, despite the nuances of their theories, and there's a multitude of them. But they have one very common thread, and that is they don't ask the question why somebody committed a crime. Classical theorists believe that people engage in criminal activity because they have free will, because they choose to engage in criminal activity, and they do this through weighing out the process of pros and cons and evaluating what will benefit them the most. In fact, classical theorists believe that human beings are hedonistic, self-seeking, self-serving, and they function under the pleasure principle. What can I do to bring me the greatest amount of pleasure and gain with the least amount of effort and cost? Okay, so it's not just crime and criminality that classical theorists believe humans use this weighing of the pros and cons to approach crime. They believe that humans use this in all aspects of their life. So, if that is true, then increasing the deterrent factor is really what stops people from committing crime because it doesn't come from some place of morality, it comes from a place of not wanting to engage in activity whose cost is going to be greater than its benefit. All right? So, understanding that classical theorists really focus on the crime, not the criminal, is important, whereas positivist theorists really focus on the criminal and ask the question why that individual is engaging in this particular activity or not engaging in this particular activity, depending on the theory. Classical theorists focus on the crime and how to prevent people from doing what would naturally come to them, which is seeking the greatest gain for the least amount of effort. So Cesar Beccaria from the 1700s, during the 1700s, wrote this essay, and he put forth some very solid concepts. First, he assumed that all criminals had free will and that pleasure and pain determined their actions. So that's a basic premise and belief system of Cesar Beccaria, and it is the foundation of all classical theorists. So again, classical theories are just a broad umbrella approach. And underneath that umbrella approach, you have lots of different theorists who create theories that line up with the big principles of classical approach to crime and criminality. Okay, so the first premise of that, of course, is that criminals have free will, that the pleasure and pain concepts absolutely determine actions, which means there's a weighing of pros and cons going into any situation, whether that is a situational evaluation of what type of crime to commit, or it's a personal evaluation of whether or not that person has what is needed to commit the crime, or needs what they will gain once they have committed the crime. The next premise that Cesar Beccaria put forth was that he believed that crime could be prevented by certainty of punishment, speed of punishment, and the appropriate severity of punishment. So he, again, really focuses on what happens in terms of deterrence. So you punish the individual, which is specific deterrence, in order to create a general deterrence for everybody else. General deterrence is an act that's done to kind of send a message and prevent multitudes of people from committing these acts. And then individual deterrence is really looking at incapacitation of that person. So in order to prevent future crime, if an individual was sure, beyond a doubt, absolutely positive, that if they committed this crime, they would be caught. All right, so prevented by certainty. That's what that means. Certainty that you will be caught and certainty that you will be punished. Think about, in terms of your own life, when you were younger and perhaps more impulsive, and you wanted to go out with friends, and you had been told no by your parents, and you weren't really going to be doing anything wrong. Nobody was going to be hurt. Nobody was going to be, drinking or doing drugs, just you and some friends going to hang out. But for whatever reason, your parents had said no. In your own mind, you felt like it was unjustified, that they had denied you this and without reason. Okay, and you were pretty sure that you could get away with going to hang out with your friends and that your parents would never know about it. Now, the likelihood that you would actually go ahead and circumvent what your parents had told you not to do and go hang out with your friends, no harm, no foul, nobody's in trouble, nothing bad is happening, you're just, gonna go to the lake and hang out for a little while with some friends and come home. And there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do that. More than likely, if you think that you can get away with it, you will. You will go to the lake, you will hang out with your friends, and you will circumvent what your parents have told you. However, the flip side to that is what Cesar Beccaria is suggesting with certainty, is that if you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that your parents will catch you and punish you for doing this, that will be the deterrent. Okay, so that's what he means by certainty. You have to know, people have to know that they will get caught, which means a strong law enforcement, and that there will be a punishment, and it will be a sanction attached to that. Okay, and that is your incarceration. So the other aspect that Cesar Beccaria said that was critical to prevent crime was speed. Speed of punishment. An individual has to be able to connect mentally, psychologically, between the event and the sanction. All right, so the punishment needs to be swift. It needs to come quickly, right on top of having committed the offense, so that there is a mental and emotional, psychological connection between those things. The other thing and last thing that he emphasized strongly was the appropriate of the severity of punishment. So you don't want the sanction to be so weak that it is not a sufficient deterrent, but you also don't want it to be so strong that it increases the chances that someone will just say, I'm going to do this anyway. And in fact, I'm not only going to do this, I'm going to do something far worse. Because if you have the same punishment for um, petty theft that you have for grand larceny, then the criminal in its logical state and in their logical state will evaluate that and say, well, if I'm going to be punished the same for this small theft as I am for this large theft, then I might as well commit the large theft. Why would I only commit this little crime? And so severity of punishment had to be appropriate. Okay. The last thing that Cesar Beccaria suggested was that all punishment should be consistently applied to everyone, regardless of age, race, gender. None of those things should matter, so that people didn't develop this sense of, oh, well, I will have an exception because I am, insert whatever demographic condition you want here. And his ideas and his concepts were well received, like I said, and many governments in Europe and in the United States altered the way that they approached crime and criminality based on this, really focusing on the crime, less on the criminality, because the criminality is the person, the crime is the situation and the event. So truly focusing on the sanction. So by the early 1900s, however, it started to decrease in popularity. So just after Cesar Beccaria had passed away, these concepts began to decline in popularity. And part of that had to do with the recognition of the impact of certain social conditions on behaviors. So in other words, people stole when they were poor because they were hungry. Whereas if they had access to food and were rich, they weren't going to steal because they didn't have a need that was going unmet. And so that realization at the turn of the century, in the beginning of the 1900s, shifted the perspective from the crime to criminality. So shifted it away from the event and onto the person. And it maintained this and moved through, and this was the development of positivism in the 1960s, and we'll look at that in later chapters. And that approach remained prevalent and strong for many, many years. Until James Q. Wilson came onto the scene. James Q. Wilson, and he is not the only current classical criminologist, however, he's the one that I'm going to highlight. And this is what you need to understand, is that there's, under the classical perspective, from as early as the 1800s with Cesar Beccaria to 2018 today, and the concepts that are applied in our policing approaches based in the research of James Q. Wilson, and everywhere in between, there have been classical criminologists creating theories. And James Q. Wilson's theory is the broken window theory. And the broken window theory really looks at how communities and community policing interact with each other to reduce crime. James Q. Wilson is a classical theorist, and he has been on 5 presidential commissions. He really focuses on increasing law enforcement presence in communities, and he was incredibly influential on the zero tolerance policies of the 1980s. Classical theories have some inherently difficult things to overcome in terms of the relativeness of choice. So an individual who has, for example, a high school diploma does not have the same level of opportunities and choices available to them as an individual who has a PhD. Because the greater your education is, the more choices you have in life, more opportunities, more pathways that you can follow. So choice is really a relative thing. But according to James Q. Wilson, it was something that we truly needed to focus on, and we needed to revisit the concepts of Cesar Beccaria and bring them back into our communities, focusing on the sanctions, focusing on building an idea amongst the communities that crime would not be tolerated, enforcement would happen, and that it was not acceptable to engage in criminal subcultures, right? And he suggested that this be done with the idea of returning urban living to a safe level. So by the 1980s, we had really seen a spike in crime in urban areas, in inner cities in particular. And James Q. Wilson suggested that it didn't have to stay that way, that we could actually do something about it by targeting areas and increasing a sense of collective efficacy, honestly, using his concept of broken windows. So if you repair the windows, if you clean up the streets, get the broken down cars off of the streets, and you encourage law enforcement to target public order crimes, not just the more serious crimes, but also public order crimes, such as public intoxication or vagrancy. If you targeted homelessness, if you targeted not only the physical aspects of cleaning up a community, but those low-level drug dealing crimes and public order crimes, that you would create a sense, a culture within that community that crime would not be tolerated, right? And so the concepts that James Q. Wilson presented were very solid in that it worked as a deterrence for that area. And I'm going to let you review the things in your chapter about specific deterrence and general deterrence. I'm going to let you look at all of the benefits and deficits to situational crime prevention. Those are really important. The craved model is extremely important. But I wanted to cover James Q. Wilson and Cesar Beccaria and kind of explain the timeline between these individuals. Rational choice theory comes out of, and this is a separate, rational choice theory is a separate theory from James Q. Wilson's, but it comes out of these ideas, okay? But one of the most important things about James Q. Wilson and his broken windows theory was that he said that, perceptions mattered. If criminals are using the concepts of free will and rational choice and evaluating pros and cons and assessing a situation, if they perceive that a neighborhood is not tolerant to crime, or their chances of getting caught are increased, then they will not commit the crime in that area. And it was very effective. But one of the main things that he focused on was not just increasing patrols, because the Kansas City experiment, of course, showed us that doesn't work. But he also, he really focused on increasing a meaningful presence of law enforcement, and which kind of lends itself towards community policing, although that's not exactly what he was targeting, okay? So really quickly before I wrap this up, I want to talk about rational choice theory. And your book does a great job of explaining the intricate aspects of rational choice theory, and I will leave you to read that and review it. But I'd like to sum it up in three things. In order for any crime to happen, there has to be these three things present, according to rational choice theory. There has to be a motivated offender. There has to be a suitable target, and there has to be an absence of a capable guardian. So if you address any of those three things, then crime is far less likely to happen. Okay? In fact, it can happen, as successfully anyway, if you remove any one of these three things: a motivated offender, a suitable target, or the absence of a capable guardian. A motivated offender. In terms of classical criminologists, you always have a motivated offender because human beings are motivated to engage in anything that will increase their status, their position, or the likelihood that they can obtain something that they want with the least amount of effort. So the motivated offender goes without saying. Suitable target. So a suitable target varies. If an individual breaks into a house, suitable targets are things that are easy to move. So they're less likely to take your leather couch than they are to take your laptop. It's because it's easy to move, it's easy to hide, throw into a car and leave, and less likely to draw attention, but also easy to get rid of. So today we have safeguarded a lot of things in terms of technology. We have a lot of blocks, passwords, facial recognition, fingerprint recognition, all types of things to prevent access into our electronics because we understand that that reduces the suitability of that target. Okay. Being able to sell it, being able to get rid of it, those things are important. And having a buyer on the other end. So even if you have a buyer, even if a target is very difficult to get to and very unique and not necessarily easy to get rid of, if you've already got a buyer, then that becomes a suitable target. And the third thing, in the absence of a capable guardian. And so in terms of a guardian, that can manifest in a lot of different ways. The passwords on computers, again, that can be constitute a guardian. Having a doorman at the entrance of an apartment building can be a capable guardian because you have someone who recognizes people coming and going all day long and is familiar with who should be there and who should not be there. A capable guardian can be video cameras. There are a variety of different things that you can use to be a guardian. It doesn't necessarily have to be a person. So for youth offenders, having a parent at home, having an after school activity, having an older sibling that's responsible present, those types of things also work towards having a capable guardian present. And according to rational choice theories, as long as you have all three of these things in place, you will have a crime. So one of the last things that I want to mention is the death penalty. And in terms of deterrence, the death penalty is very controversial. Most research does show that the death penalty does not have the kind of impact on reducing the number of deaths, homicides in a state that we anticipate that it will. And yet we maintain the death penalty in several states as a form of general and specific deterrence. So review some of the literature on the death penalty and make sure that you kind of understand the reality of whether or not the death penalty is effective in terms of deterrence. And oftentimes, deterrence is not as effective as we anticipate that it will be. So, for example, we learned in previous chapters that registrants, sex offenders, having to be registered on a list that identifies them as a sex offender does not work as a deterrent in terms of reducing the chances that that individual will be engaging in that activity again, right? So deterrence is something that can be very tricky. Some of the things that we think of as being successful when you really evaluate the research, which is why we spent a lot of time looking at how research is collected and created. When you really look at the research, you begin to understand that it's not effective as we would like it to be. Neighborhood watch programs are one of the things that I want to mention, though, in terms of effectiveness. because neighborhood watch programs build collective efficacy, which is a term we will revisit off and on throughout the chapters moving forward. And collective efficacy is the concepts of building community, engagement, awareness, involvement. Collective efficacy goes towards the broken windows series of theory of James Q. Wilson, because it shows a presence in the neighborhood of a multitude of people engaged and present mentally and physically in their environment. And so neighborhood watch programs are actually very effective deterrents. All right, so with that, I am going to close this video up. Please read your chapter, do your assignments, and I am really enjoying reading the assignments and the discussions that you are posting. Have a wonderful day.